It's hard to imagine there would have been a United States of America without George Washington. He was there at the birth of the nation. He successfully guided it through war and nurtured it in peace. How did he do it? Not by being a great general, a potent political theorist, or even a clever politician. He was none of those things. And yet he was admired by generals, political theorists, and politicians. Why? Because he was a man great men trusted. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and so many others looked up to him. Literally. He was one of the tallest men of his era at 6'3". Add courage, integrity, and wisdom, and you have a truly impressive figure. Let's start with his courage. That was never in doubt. If anything, he had too much of it. Bold to the point of rashness as a young man, he fought for the British against the French over control of the Ohio Valley, then the westernmost point of the American wilderness. Throughout that conflict, known as the French and Indian War, and the American Revolution, Washington was always in the thick of the action. His aides often struggled to keep him from surging too far ahead of his own troops. In one battle, his coat was pierced 4 times by musket fire. Horses were shot out from under him. Amazingly, some would say miraculously, he was never wounded, not so much as a flesh wound. By the time the Revolution broke out in April of 1775, Washington was firmly committed to the cause of American independence. He arrived in Philadelphia in May of that year to offer his services to the Continental Congress. He was quickly made commander of the new rebel army. There was only one problem. There was no army to speak of. There was just a ragtag collection of state militias. How was Washington going to defeat the greatest military force in the world with that? It was a problem the general struggled with for 8.5 years. That he managed to hold the army together, organize it into a disciplined fighting force, and guide it to victory was testament to his fortitude, his patience, and his personal bravery. Of his integrity, one need only look at what he did when the war ended, exactly what he had promised to do when the war began. He resigned his military command and went home to Mount Vernon. By stepping down, Washington raised himself up as the embodiment of Republican heroism. It is said that King George III asked the London-based American painter, Benjamin West, what Washington was likely to do when peace came. West replied that Washington would probably return to his farm. The king was astounded. If he does that, His Majesty declared, he will be the greatest man in the world. This story may be apocryphal, but the Newburgh Rebellion and how Washington handled it is not. With experience had come wisdom. As the revolution wound down, a group of officers refused to give up their arms until they were paid. If they didn't get their money, which Congress didn't have, they would take control of the government. It was not an idle threat, no less a figure that Alexander Hamilton was in a panic. Washington, no great orator, sought to diffuse their anger. They had risked everything to create a Republican society, he told the officers. To abandon the cause now, when true victory was so close, would mean all their sacrifices would have been in vain. However convincing the speech may have been, it was a simple gesture that carried the day. He concluded his remarks by reading to them a letter sent to him from a member of Congress. Suddenly he stopped. From his pocket he pulled a pair of spectacles. None of the officers had ever seen him wear them. Putting the glasses on, Washington said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in the service of my country, and now find myself going blind." He finished reading the letter and left the hall without another word. The gesture, sincerely offered with just the right touch of stagecraft, pierced the hearts of his men. Many were moved to tears. They immediately passed a resolution declaring their loyalty to civilian government. George Washington had saved the Revolution once again. It wouldn't be the last time. During the writing of the Constitution and during his 8 years as president, Washington was repeatedly called upon to hold the fractious young nation together. He never failed to do so. We commonly refer to George Washington now as the father of our country. It's hard to imagine any nation ever had a better one. I'm John Roadhamel, author of George Washington, The Wonder of the Age, for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Can you imagine in this day and age an educational institution discriminating against a racial minority? Can you imagine what the outcry would be? You mean you're preventing these qualified students from attending your college because of the color of their skin? Well, you don't have to imagine it. It's happening. And at arguably the most prestigious college in America, my alma mater, Harvard. The ethnic minority isn't blacks or Jews as it was in years past. The target this time is Asian Americans, and it's just as wrong. After millions of dollars in legal fees, millions of records examined, and hundreds of hours of depositions and testimony, Harvard's once purposely opaque admissions policies have been laid bare. It's not a pretty picture. Here's what we now know. Harvard admissions rates student applicants in three main ways. 1, academic performance. 2, extracurricular achievements. 3, personal qualities. That's fine as far as it goes if the criteria were applied fairly, but they're not. Asian American applicants consistently score higher in the first two criteria, academics and extracurricular activities, which can be objectively assessed, than white students, Latinos, and African Americans. So how does Harvard justify its Asian American quota? With the help of Category 3, personal qualities, which include vague and largely subjective factors like likability, maturity, integrity, and effervescence. According to Harvard's own internal reports, Asian American applicants are routinely and systematically marked much lower on this personality scale by Harvard admissions officers who almost never meet or interview applicants. But here's the kicker. The personality ratings given to Asian students by admissions officers are vastly different than the personality ratings Harvard gets from its own alumni interviewers who actually meet the applicants in person. Alumni interviewers score Asian applicants as high as whites. In other words, Harvard artificially and fraudulently downgrades Asians on personality to get the results it wants. And what Harvard wants is to suppress the number of Asian Americans admitted. Based on the data that Harvard was forced to turn over, economist Peter Asadiakono of Duke University concluded that with the same application profile in terms of test scores, extracurricular activities, and personality factors, an Asian American male applicant would only have a 25% chance of admission versus 32% if white, 77% if Hispanic, and 95% if black. What's the real-life result of all this? In 2013, Asian Americans made up 19% of the incoming freshman class. According to Harvard's own Office of Institutional Research, if the personality factors had not been rigged, that percentage would have been 43%. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guarantees that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Each year, Harvard takes hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government. In Grutter v. Bollinger, the Supreme Court upheld the University of Michigan Law School's affirmative action policies, deciding that race could be used as a plus factor to achieve diversity, but never as a quota. Yet by placing strict limits on the percentage of Asian American applicants it will admit, racial quotas are exactly what Harvard is using. One strongly suspects this quota system isn't limited to Harvard. In the last 10 years, Asian American students have been limited to an 18 to 22% presence across the Ivy League. Or maybe that's just a coincidence. Writing for the majority in Grutter v. Bollinger in 2003, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote that the court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. With less than a decade to go, the Ivy League shows no indication that it's giving up on those racial preferences. Instead, these colleges have doubled down. Objective standards regarding admissions continue to be increasingly disfavored as the illegal goal of racial balancing is advanced. This racial balancing is justified by the left's desire to achieve racial diversity. Its insistence on seeing every person only through the prism of race, as if the most important thing any of us has to offer is the color of our skin. Not long ago, that was called racism. It's still called racism. It needs to end once and for all for the sake of deserving Asian American students, for the sake of Harvard's own integrity, and for the sake of the American principle that the rules must be the same for everyone. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Roberts said it best. The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. It's time we did just that. I'm Cheng of the Asian American Legal Foundation for Prager University.
Do you and I share the same goals? If we do, we can disagree, even strongly disagree, and still have a productive discussion. We might even reach a compromise. But if we don't share the same goals, then what? Then, rhetorically speaking, we're at war, and only one side can win. Let me explain. My parents and brother lean more to the liberal side of the political spectrum than I do. We argue, we slightly nudge each other, we change opinions a little bit, and then we go back to Scrabble. They were very upset when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. I was happy. We argued about it, but it was all good because we share the same goals. We all want clean air and water for our children. We all want to develop clean energy. We want America's economy to prosper. We want to be less reliant on fossil fuels. I thought the Accords were a bad deal for America. The best way to lower carbon emissions, in my opinion, is to let the free market and American ingenuity loose on the problem. They, in contrast, think the government needs to step in, fund the research, and keep the corporations in line. Doesn't matter, because we have the same goal, a healthy planet. We also disagree on gun control. My brother's a little more with me, but my dad wants a lot more regulation because he wants fewer school shootings. So do I. So does my brother. But I believe if a potential killer knew he'd encounter teachers and administrators well-trained in the use of weapons, we'd have less shootings. Different solutions, shared goal. I've always thought this is how America is supposed to work. Liberals and conservatives respectfully arguing over the best solution to a shared goal. But now there's a third party in the game, the left. And they're changing the rules. When I was growing up, the left was on the fringe, but now they've moved into the mainstream. They've pretty much taken over our educational system. They're in the media, in corporate HR departments, and more, sad to say, in the Democratic Party. The left doesn't share the same goals that liberals and conservatives do. They have a whole different set of goals. Let me give you some examples. Raising kids without a gender identity or encouraging them to question their sexual identity. This, to me, is a form of child abuse. I don't care who's doing it. Parents, teachers, doctors. Their goal is not my goal. Here's another one. Demonizing white people and males for the world's problems is not part of my value system. There is no shared goal in that. I believe in merit and character over race. But now it's cool to say that white males have done all the bad things in the world. I have 2 little boys. I get angry just thinking about people telling them they're responsible for racism and sexism. Beautiful little children who just dance in the kitchen and smile. So that's not a shared goal. Here's the third example. People can differ about how many legal immigrants America should allow into the country. But when it comes to whether America should have open borders, well, there's no shared goal there. A country with open borders ceases to be a distinct country. And I want America to remain America. All these ideas, and I could give you a dozen more, are coming from the left. They want to turn the history of Western civilization, of America, a history I'm very proud of, into a highlight reel of human errors. These ideas threaten everything I cherish, my family, my community, my country. And what does the left offer in its place? Nothing constructive that I can see. What are their goals? Kids with no clear sexual identity? Groupthink based on race, gender, class? No national pride or borders. Are you okay with that? My issue is not with liberals like my brother and my dad and a lot of my friends. We can argue until the cows come home. My issue is with the left because we don't share goals. This war of goals isn't coming. It's here. You need to decide which side you're on, the liberals and conservative side or the left's. Your future depends on it. I'm Owen Benjamin for Prager University.
I was elected to the Parliament of Canada 7 times, 3 times as Prime Minister. I did not expect Donald Trump to be elected President of the United States. But unlike most observers, I did think it was at least possible. Why? Because I sensed, as Mr. Trump surely did, that the political landscape had shifted. The underlying issue is this. Over the last few decades, thanks to globalization, 1 billion people, mostly in the emerging markets of Asia, have lifted themselves out of poverty. This, of course, is a good thing. Yet in many Western countries, the incomes of working people have stagnated or even declined over the same period. In short, many Americans voted for Donald Trump because the global economy has not been working for them. We can pretend that this is a false perception. We can keep trying to convince people that they misunderstand their own lives. Or we can try to understand what they are saying and offer some solutions. I prefer the latter approach. Let me begin with this. In our contemporary world, there are, as British journalist David Goodhart describes it, those who can live anywhere and those who live somewhere. Imagine you work for an international bank, computer company, or consulting firm. You can wake up in New York, London, or Singapore and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. You vocally support all international trade agreements and high levels of immigration. You're one of those who can live anywhere. There are a lot of those people, but there are a lot more completely unlike them. Let's say you're a factory worker, small business person, or in retail sales. Your work has been disrupted by outsourcing, cheap imports, and technological change. Your children attend the local schools and your aging parents live nearby. Your social life is connected to a local church, sports team, or community group. If things go badly at your company, or if policy choices by politicians turn out to be wrong, you can't just shift your life to somewhere else. Like it or not, you depend on the economic policies of your national or state government. When it doesn't come through for you, you're not happy. And when it ignores you entirely, you get angry. It's easy for anywheres to dismiss these concerns. But the anywhere's faith in global solutions and multinational political bodies is founded more on fantasy than fact. The fact is, the critical functions of laws and regulations and monetary and fiscal stability, among other things, are provided by nations, not global institutions. The nation, with all its flaws, is a concrete reality. The global community is little more than a concept. Yet it is the anywheres, with their faith in globalization, not the somewheres, who have dominated the politics of almost every advanced country. That is, until now. This sea change is not limited to the United States. The same dynamics, anywhere elites versus somewhere populace, is playing out across the Western world. These populists, as I've tried to show, are not the ignorant and misguided deplorables depicted in mainstream media. They are our family, friends, and neighbors. The populists represent, by definition, the interests of ordinary people. And in a democratic system, the people are supposed to be our customers. So how, then, can we best serve them? I propose an approach I call populist conservatism. Grounding ourselves in tried and true conservative values, we must speak to the issues that concern the somewheres and their families, those of ordinary people, not elites. Those issues include market economics, trade, globalization, and immigration. In addressing these issues, conservatives should remain pro-free market, pro-trade, pro-globalization, and pro-immigration. Going in a completely opposite direction in any of these areas is a mistake. But being pro-market does not mean that all regulations should be dismantled or that government should never intervene to protect workers. Being pro-trade does not imply that every trade agreement is a good one. Being pro-globalization should not entail abdicating loyalty or responsibility to our country and our local communities. And being pro-immigration should never mean sanctioning illegal immigration, erasing our borders, or ignoring the interests of our citizens. I call this populist conservatism, but it's really just conservatism. Conservatism is about seeing the world as it is. It's also inherently populist because it is about serving real people rather than theories. I'm Stephen Harper, author of Right Here, Right Now, Politics and Leadership in the Age of Disruption for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
He's a millionaire. Even today, that phrase has a magical ring to it. And what image do you see? Probably a guy in a $1,000 suit pulling up in his luxury car to his 10-bedroom mansion. He doesn't have a care in the world. Why should he? He's got all the money in the world. Who knows how he got it? Maybe his parents left it to him, or he got lucky in the stock market, or acquired it in some dishonest way. What does it matter? It's out of your reach, right? I don't blame you if you think this way. I thought that way once myself. It's how Hollywood and the popular media like to portray the wealthy, the 1%. But it couldn't be further from the truth. How can I say that? Because my research team and I surveyed and interviewed over 10,000 millionaires. We learned a lot about them. What we found out surprised me, and I suspect will surprise you too. But before I explode some millionaire myths, let me first define what I mean by a millionaire. It means someone who has $1 million in net assets. That is, the total of their assets, bank accounts, and investments, minus debts, totals $1 million or more. According to a recent report, there are almost 11 million millionaires in the United States today, more than ever. But here's the kicker. That same report shows the number of people living paycheck to paycheck is on the rise, with 1 in 3 unable to cover a $2,000 emergency with cash. The key difference between the so-called haves and have-nots, well, that's what really blew us away. But before I give you the answer, I need to deal with some myths about the millionaires we talked to. Myth number 1, wealthy people inherited all their money. The truth is, 79% of millionaires receive zero inheritance. That's right, zip from mom and dad. They earned it all on their own. Myth number 2, wealthy people are lucky. This is the one that I believed for a long time. But in reality, 76% of millionaires say that nothing extraordinary happened to enhance their wealth. No lottery wins, no stock market killing. Discipline and hard work were the key factors. As for luck, the luckiest thing in most of their lives was being born in or becoming a citizen of the United States. Myth number 3, wealthy people have prestigious private school educations. Wrong again. 62% of millionaires went to public state schools. You don't have to go to an Ivy League school to do well. Myth number 4, wealthy people have high-paying jobs. Not true at all. 1/3 of millionaires never had a 6-figure household income in a single working year. Really, I'm not making it up. So what makes these millionaires so extraordinary? You ready for the shocking answer? Here it is. Nothing. Nothing at all. Remember, I said that there was one key thing that separated the haves from the have-nots. It's the attitude millionaires have toward money. They have learned to control it and not let it control them. So if you want to achieve financial security, you need to change your mindset. The sooner, the better. You have to start with the belief that it's possible for you to become a millionaire. I can give you 10,000 examples of people like you who have done it. Next, you have to take responsibility for where you are financially right now. And wherever you are and however you got there, you've got to own it. My friend Dave Ramsey says, if you're the problem, it also means you're the solution. And that's actually good news. It means your financial destiny is in your own hands. Once you've accepted where you are, you have to create a plan and set goals. You need to pay off debt and build up savings methodically. 92% of millionaires set long-term goals for their money. There are no shortcuts. Reaching millionaire status won't just happen accidentally. It takes what I call intense intentionality and, of course, hard work. But I believe just about anyone who's willing to work hard and be disciplined about spending and saving can become a millionaire in America today. If you had talked to all the ordinary Americans like I have, who have made it, you'd believe it too. The opportunity is there. Take it. This is America, where there's always room for one more millionaire. I'm Chris Hogan, author of Everyday Millionaires for Prager University.
Have you ever waited in line for hours at the state-run DMV? Or wanted to pull your hair out at the government-operated post office? Well, if some governors and members of Congress have it their way, government red tape and lackluster customer service would also extend to healthcare. Government-run healthcare has recently been repackaged as Medicare for all and is a big move away from free market competition. As a result, the quality of service will likely drop and taxes will skyrocket. Many medical professionals have also indicated they won't participate in a government-run healthcare system, so you may not be able to keep your existing doctor. In practice, this could mean waiting hours for much-needed medical care or up to a year for surgery, a major problem for time-sensitive procedures. The price tag of Medicare for All is also jaw-dropping. Instituting the program is estimated to cost over $3 trillion per year. That's more than the U.S. government spent on military, health care, Social Security, and other entitlement benefits combined in 2015. Inevitably, that additional financial burden would fall onto the American taxpayer, slowing economic growth and stifling business expansion. Medicare for All may sound good in a campaign stump speech, but putting the idea into practice is risky and comes down to one question: how do we pay for it?
As an historian, I'm often asked if I could stop one event in modern history from happening, what would it be? My answer is World War I. If there had been no World War I, there would have been no Russian Revolution, no World War II, no Holocaust, no Cold War. And that doesn't even consider the millions who died in the war itself. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Europe experienced an unprecedented period of economic growth. Brought about by the Industrial Revolution, this new prosperity spawned rapid developments in science, medicine, art, and political philosophy. The future of civilization never looked brighter. And then suddenly, it all went up in flames. The fuse was lit in June 1914 in a street in Sarajevo, Bosnia. It was there that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. It should have been no more than a sad footnote in history. Instead, it changed history. Austria-Hungary, seeking to avenge the Archduke's murder, declared war on Serbia. But before taking this drastic step, it asked for and received a blessing from its powerful ally, Germany. Serbia, knowing that it had no chance against Austria-Hungary, called on its ally, Russia, to defend it. Russia agreed. To strengthen its hand, Russia solicited French support should war break out. France, ever suspicious of German intentions, assented. Germany then made a preemptive move to take France out of the war. The German command, having long planned this war, invaded France through neutral Belgium. This prompted Britain to join France against Germany. Suddenly, the entire continent was engulfed in war. The key player was Germany. Their strategy was to punch through Belgium and France and capture Paris before the French had time to react. This was the so-called Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who conceived it. With France conquered, they would turn their attention to Russia. That Germany thought it would actually work comes down to one man, Germany's leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Emperor of Germany from 1888 until his forced abdication in 1918, Wilhelm was a profoundly unpleasant, unstable, and vicious personality. By 1914, he believed that Germany should not only dominate Europe, but the entire world. Had the Schlieffen Plan worked, Germany most certainly would have. But it didn't work. The British and the French put up stiff resistance in the West. Russia did the same in the East. The losses incurred by all sides were immediate and appalling. The widespread use, for the first time, of barbed wire, machine guns, tanks, and worst of all, poison gas, turns the fields of France and the steppes of Russia into vast cemeteries. By 1917, the war was at a stalemate. Who knows how long it would have stayed that way if the United States had not been drawn in. Ironically, President Woodrow Wilson had been elected largely because he promised to keep America out of Europe's war. His attitude changed when Germany attacked American merchant ships in the Atlantic. The final straw was the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany promised to give Mexico, in exchange for its military support, much of the American Southwest, including Texas. The infusion of American manpower and weaponry allowed the Allies to take the initiative. The war finally ended in November of 1918. 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. 3 million Russians, 2.5 million Germans, 1.7 million French, 1 million British, and 117,000 Americans. Russia was now in the hands of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. France and Britain were physically and morally shattered. Germany, forced into a humiliating surrender treaty at Versailles, would soon be further decimated by runaway inflation that destroyed what was left of its economy. Meanwhile, the United States retreated into isolationism. It was a pause, not a peace. The stage was being set for a new and very much worse disaster, a Second World War, one that would lead to 3 times the deaths of the first one. It would be instigated by a madman who fought for the Kaiser and shared the same dream of world domination. Had it not been for World War I, we would never have heard of him. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
It's a nasty truth, but those who seek to inflict harm are not fazed by gun control laws. I happen to know this from personal experience. You know, I've always felt a special bond with the members of your group. You live by Lincoln's words. Important principles may and must be inflexible. Your philosophy put its trust in people, so you insist on individuals be held responsible for their actions. The NRA believes that America's laws were made to be obeyed and that our constitutional liberties are just as important today as 200 years ago. And by the way, the Constitution does not say that government shall decree the right to keep and bear arms. The Constitution says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
The next time you hear a politician call for common sense gun control, listen for the details. You are likely to be treated to a torrent of platitudes about assault weapons, gun show sales, and other half measures. These sorts of proposals are rooted in a theory of gun control that has been around since the 1960s. The basic idea is that fewer guns equal less gun crime. But for this theory to have even a chance of working, drastic reductions in the supply of guns will be necessary. Everything else amounts to security theater. The late Senator Howard Metzenbaum, a strong gun control advocate, explained it this way: if you don't ban all guns, you might as well ban none of them. But few, if any, politicians who call for common sense gun control have the courage to propose this. even putting aside the issue of the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which affirms the right to keep and bear arms. A gun ban has no broad popular support. Never mind the conservative states. Handgun ban referendums failed by large margins in two of our most liberal states, Massachusetts in 1976 and California in 1982. No serious attempts have been made since then. Recently, Australia's gun control efforts have gained new prominence as a possible model for the United States to follow. Let's take a closer look at Australia. In 1996, after a lunatic used a semi-automatic rifle to murder 34 people in Tasmania, the Australian government banned all semi-automatic rifles and repeating shotguns. Owners of roughly 700,000 registered firearms, about a quarter of the country's 3 million total guns, were required to turn them in for destruction. The government called this a buyback, but in fact no one had a choice. As my research shows, this model will not work in the United States for the simple reason that the U.S. has roughly 325 million guns. This is orders of magnitude more than any other country. Even if the Australian plan were tried in the U.S. and worked to perfection, we'd still be left with over 200 million guns, including handguns, which account for nearly 80% of gun crime. But gun confiscation has never worked to perfection, and sometimes threatens to make things worse.
500 years ago, on October 31st, 1517, a German Catholic monk by the name of Martin Luther posted some complaints he had about the Catholic Church on a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther was upset by the church practice of selling what were known as indulgences to wealthy patrons. Indulgences might be loosely described as get-out-of-hell free cards. Pay this amount to the church, and the church would make sure you don't suffer unduly for your sins in the hereafter. Luther felt very strongly that the practice not only made the church look bad in the eyes of the common people, but had no scriptural basis. He believed the church needed to reform itself or would lose its legitimacy. Nobody, including Luther, thought that his complaints, and he had made a list of 95 of them, would amount to much. He simply wanted to spark a discussion on an issue that deeply concerned him. Instead, he set off a chain reaction that literally changed the course of history. The name we give to this change is the Protestant Reformation. Had Luther limited his criticism of the church to indulgences, as his friend, the Dutch scholar Erasmus, urged him to do, the matter might have been resolved and the old order preserved. But the headstrong Luther was not someone to be restrained. Luther was what we would call today a flawed individual. He was brilliant and charismatic, but he was also vindictive and stubborn to a fault, and at the end of his life, sadly, anti-Semitic. Luther believed there should be no separation between the Bible and the believer. Every individual should have access to the Word of God, Luther contended, as any priest did, or even the Pope. We take this view for granted now, but in the 16th century it was a radical concept. And here's why. For more than 1,000 years, the Church had been the dominant religious and political authority in Europe. It alone taught Christians how to understand the Bible. Luther was now challenging the very basis of this authority. Not surprisingly, the Church didn't take it well. What began as a squabble between a bold monk and the Catholic hierarchy soon developed into a titanic and bloody struggle that split Europe into opposing religious factions. But the consequences of Luther's ideas extended far beyond a religious dispute. It's not an exaggeration to say that as a result of Luther's ideas, the modern individual was born, a free actor, endowed with God-given rights that exist independent of government or any other institution. Each person could find those rights by reading and interpreting the Bible for himself. Of course, to do that, you had to be able to read the Bible, and throughout the first millennium right up until Luther's day, only a very few people could. Books, including the Bible, were all handwritten, a process usually that took months. This made books rare and expensive. Furthermore, most Bibles were written in Latin, the language of the Church, a language familiar only to the clergy and educated elite. This exclusivity was one of the many ways in which the Church maintained its power. Luther answered this problem by translating the Bible into everyday German so that anyone could read it. But his efforts would all have been for naught except for the recent invention of the printing press by a fellow German, Johannes Gutenberg. The printing press allowed for the first time in history books, and soon thereafter pamphlets and newspapers, to be widely distributed. Without the printing press, Luther would have likely suffered the same grim fate of other reformers before him, like Jan Hus, who was tried, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake. But because of the printing press, Luther's movement could not be stopped, and indeed could not be controlled. Bloody religious wars between Catholic and Protestant forces quickly followed on the heels of Luther's new ideas. They lasted for 200 years and cost countless lives. The 30 Years' War alone from 1618 to 1648 is reputed to have led to about 8 million deaths from fighting, famine, and disease. But out of all this carnage, many positive changes came too. The Protestant empowerment of the individual led to capitalism and the Enlightenment, just to name two byproducts of Luther's protest. The American Revolution, with its idea that individuals endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights should be free to form their own government, was another. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, all but one was a Protestant. Pronouncing a verdict on an epoch as significant as the Reformation is very difficult. Perhaps it's best not even to try. But we can say this: no other single figure made more of an impact on the modern world than the German monk, Martin Luther. And even he would be surprised to know that. I'm Stephen Cornels of Wartburg Theological Seminary for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
We will keep this promise to the American people. If you like your doctor, you will be able to keep your doctor, period. If you like your health care plan, you will be able to keep your health care plan, period.
We weren't as clear as we needed to be in terms of the changes that were taking place. And I am sorry that they are finding themselves in this situation based on assurances they got from me.
It's very easy for a politician to stand up before voters and say healthcare is a right, and then passionately advocate for single payer or free healthcare or Medicare for all, whatever term they might use. But before we consider the merits of the government managing your healthcare, and that's what this all boils down to, maybe we should ask a more basic question. What do we mean by healthcare? Because if you get sick, and here we're talking major illness or you're in serious pain, you don't just want healthcare. You want quality health care. And where is your best chance of finding that? The answer is right here in America. For skilled doctors, cutting-edge medical treatments, and care without long delays, no other country rivals the United States. Not even close. Nobody from Texas is going to Canada for medical treatment. It's almost always the other way around. Sure, our healthcare system has lots of issues, and we should address them. But do we really want to upend all the advantages that we do have and start from scratch? Because that's what would have to happen if we completely turn healthcare over to the government. So let's imagine we make the change. We hear a lot about how great free healthcare would be, but it's only fair we look at the downside. The first is that government-run healthcare takes medical decisions away from patients, that means you, and puts them in the hands of bureaucrats. They decide, for example, how many MRI machines are going to be available, or under what conditions you can get back surgery or a bypass, or even whether you qualify for cancer treatment. That's how it works in the United Kingdom under its single-payer system. Because it has finite resources, the National Health Service, or NHS, sharply restricts access to treatments like hip and knee replacements, cataract surgery, and even prescription drugs to deal with common conditions like arthritis and diabetes. If you suffer from any of these ailments and many others in the UK, you may just have to live with the pain. And let's hope you don't have a medical emergency. In a January 2018 article in the New York Times, patients in emergency rooms around London are described as having to wait 12 hours before they are tended to. Corridors are jammed with beds carrying the frail and elderly. To deal with the situation, hospitals were ordered to postpone non-urgent surgeries until the end of the month. That hardly seems like an improvement over what we have in the US. A second big problem with single-payer systems is that they are expensive. really expensive. A recent study by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University found that a Bernie Sanders-style Medicare for All health system would cost a tidy $32.6 trillion over 10 years. That's on top of what the federal government spends on healthcare today. And this is not a new number. Other studies have found the cost to be roughly in the same range. So, how would we pay for it? Kenneth Thorpe, a professor at Emory University and health policy official in the Clinton administration, spells it out. If you are going to go in this direction, Medicare for all, the tax increases are going to be enormous. Not just for the rich, Thorpe estimates, but for working Americans and the poor too. Charles Blauhaus, the author of the Mercatus study, puts it this way. Even a doubling of all projected individual and corporate income taxes would be insufficient to finance these added federal costs. And he considers that a conservative estimate. Canada knows all about exploding healthcare costs. In Ontario, the country's biggest province, those costs took up 46% of its entire budget in 2010. By 2030, that number is projected to be 80%. In other words, in a few years, Ontario will have little money to pay for anything except health care. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, government-run systems depress the search for new cures. Biomedical research spending in the U.S. far outpaces that of any country with nationalized health care, even when you account for differences in population or size of economies. That's one reason medical breakthroughs rarely come from countries where the government controls health care. They come from the United States, where the government doesn't. The lion's share of biomedical research and development spending in the U.S., over $70 billion in 2012, comes from the private sector. Discovering new medical cures and technology is a profitable business, and thank goodness it is. Those profits drive innovation. Take away the profits, and you will surely take away the innovation. Single-payer, free health care, Medicare for all, they might sound great, but like all visions of utopia, they ultimately produce a lot more harm than good. I'm Lanhee Chen, fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford for Prager University.